Thank you so much. Brilliant.
Shall I just show you? Yeah, I'm sure you're going to get busy in a minute. Yeah. I'm going to begin from the beginning. I'm going to show you these people. And I'll then just sneak out. And what you'll need to do at the end of your exercise, which is there's not very fun, is go to this stop, which is this stop. And I'm just running this stop.
No.
Are you happy with the angle of the shot? Just as doing
Any example of the so you can see the apartment. If possible, yeah, this is just to see that. You
it just depends. Some people don't want to see something.
Very good.
So just hit stop and then
Stop, and that's it. And what I'll do is I'll run it as a YouTube so that you can get it to see here, you'll see it.
This one will do both. Both will be great. Thank you.
Brilliant.
You guys have pictures of everything. I'll put some sparkling water down in the garden when you're back. Okay?
Good evening. All right. Great. Oh, the one thing we didn't get was probably be okay.
I did speak to Nicky about the lab.
Yeah. So,
Let me just go and see.
yeah, if it's possible, just kind of less stress on the eyes.
2, 1, 2.
You won't be alone.
No. It was this or stand out in the cold.
Right. How are things going?
Very well, thank you.
Great.
Just finishing up a chapter to put into an edited volume.
Oh, great.
So that's my sort of focus
Fantastic.
before Christmas.
Who's editing the volume?
It is a hispanist at Chester. Who's a lovely, lovely man. Mark Gant is his name. He's British. And it should be coming out quite quickly because everyone is so
Hey, Ollie.
they're so paranoid about this REF.
REF, yes, indeed.
So the faster the better. It's so commodification of publishing, but
It's okay, we all understand. Better to get in early than late.
yes. Is this going to be similar to the talk that you gave at the workshop last year?
I hope not. I hope not.
That's all. Hey, it's the last week that I have to like this time I use
Not right back, I will be. All right, middle. Nice fruit.
There's no need to. It's still
Everything I am Gary Burstall-Mellon, Professor of American History. Before I say anything more, let me say that there are 3 seats down here for those of you sitting on the floor. If you'd like to come down and take a seat, there's one right here, if you could put your hand up. One right there, and there's one next to Tony Hopkins, second row. Anyone? No? Anyone else? Tony, they're scared of you.
I'm scared of them.
I am the Mellon Professor of American History. It's not ordinarily my duty to introduce a Professor of African History. That would fall to our chair, Tim Harper, Chair of the History Faculty, who would ordinarily be presiding. But there was another date for this lecture originally, and then it had to be switched because of a fundamental conflict. And Tim had plans to be in the Netherlands at that point, and that's where he is now, sending his deepest regrets. It is my pleasure to step into his place for a very special occasion. I want to try and put into words why I enjoy these inaugurals so much. At a very mundane level, the assembly of such a large cross-section of the history faculty is itself a special event where it happens so rarely. We are simply too big. Approximately 100 regular faculty, plus another 10 to 20 junior research fellows, plus several hundred MPhils and PhD students. We are a small nation, so it is next to impossible to gather us all, except for events such as these. The rarity of these gatherings is part of what makes them special. But inaugurals are something more. They are an occasion to pause from our manifold everyday labors and reflect on who we are and what we want to be. A distinguished new scholar has arrived. What is the nature of his or her scholarship? What difference will his or her scholarship make to Cambridge? What does his or her arrival say about where we have been and where we want to go? In regard both to the new professor's specific fields and the faculty's broader trajectory. We will not get full answers today. No 50 to 60-minute lecture can ever do that. But we will certainly come away with a sharper sense of our future and the intellectual possibilities it holds. It is indeed an exciting moment. There's a chair here, and one more here. We are gathered here today to welcome Saul Dubow as the Smuts Professor of Commonwealth History. It is always important to identify the shoulders on which a new professor stands. Philip Nicholas Seton Mansoura was the first Smuts professor appointed in 1953. Eric Thomas Stokes was the second. David Anthony Lowe the third. Anthony Hopkins, Tony, right here, the fourth. And Megan Vaughn, the fifth. The chair itself was established in 1952. The campaign to establish the post began among Smuts' supporters in South Africa, but it was a cause quickly embraced by the British establishment for reasons that the circumstances of our own political time help us to understand. In 1948, South Africa had veered in a sharply racist direction. The nationalists had triumphed in a Trump-like rebuke to internationalist and liberal values. It was shocking that such a frankly racist regime had come to power so close on the heels of the Holocaust and the revulsion toward regimes of racial purity that it had provoked. In this moment, members of the British establishment, from Attlee to Churchill, urgently sought to honor South African figures who stood apart from apartheid and who could be seen as carriers of a better past and perhaps a better future. Smuts was such a figure, a modern man, liberal, internationalist, and of course deeply committed to a liberalizing British Empire struggling to rebirth itself as a commonwealth of more or less equal nations. Saul Dubow is the first South African elected to this chair. Born in Cape Town, he received his BA in African History from the University of Cape Town in 1980. He took his DPhil at Oxford St. Anthony's College writing a dissertation on segregation in South Africa in the pre-apartheid era, published by Macmillan in 1989 as Racial Segregation and the Origins of Apartheid in 20th Century South Africa, 1919 to 1936. From 1989 to 2012, Saul taught at the University of Sussex. In 2012, he became Professor of African History at Queen Mary University of London, and in 2017, he became Smuts Professor of Commonwealth History at Cambridge. He is part of that very significant group of South African academics who in the grim 1980s went into exile, largely permanent exile it turned out, but who have remained deeply involved with their homeland intellectually, personally, and in some cases, politically. Saul is a South African historian. He is an African historian. He is a world historian, and he is a global intellectual historian. He is the author of 6 books, and he has edited or co-edited another 5. He has published dozens of articles. He is a leading authority on apartheid, his work in this area notable for its breadth and complexity. Saul's work on the subject vividly brings into play the various contexts that shape the rise and fall of the apartheid regime. Ideology, religion, state power, international politics loom large among those contexts. Saul's work is resolutely anti-teleological. He refuses to treat the emergence of apartheid as preordained by the imperatives of settler colonialism, or to treat the fall of this pariah state as inevitable. Instead, he emphasizes contingency, conjuncture, circumstance. He is always on the lookout for surprising historical developments, forever alert to paths not taken. Saul's work is also remarkable for the ease with which it both scales up to take in large events such as the Cold War and scales down to ponder South African particularities such as the idiosyncrasy of Afrikaner Calvinism and Republicanism. The range of Saul's work, its dexterity, its mixing of the global and the local are among its exceptional features. Saul is particularly interested in the role of science in the making of modern South Africa. Not surprisingly, he is an authority on social Darwinism and scientific racism. But he is also an authority on how science, across a much broader front, became an instrument for maintaining white power in South Africa across the 20th century. There is a hint of tragedy in Saul's acclaimed work, A Commonwealth of Knowledge, Science, Sensibility in White South Africa, 1820 to 2000, published in 2006. In it, Saul reconstructs how substantial portions of the white South African scientific community in the early 20th century aspired to be liberal, international, modern, British, and reformist on race. Its members were not reactionary Afrikaners, but generously and progressively minded. They were at the center of knowledge-making in South Africa. As such, they had prestige. They had power. They had it within their grasp, Saul seems to suggest, to address the problems of racial division and inequality in an egalitarian way. But they did not, choosing instead to make science a tool for uniting the various portions of the white race, Afrikaner, British, and European, and for enshrining white privilege and superiority in law, economics, and culture. Jan Smuts was a central figure in this drama, a champion of South African science, a liberally minded internationalist in so many ways, yet unable to see beyond a world divided between superior whites and inferior blacks. The new Smuts professor has shown us, in other words, how Smuts himself embodies the tragedy of South Africa. There was a time when one could comfortably look with condescension upon South Africa's 20th century trajectory. Such a backward, racist place. Now we know better. Of course, Saul has known all along that the forces at work in South Africa were global forces as much as local forces. That those of us who have come from other societies and places have long had to contend with their influence. That the pasts and future of South Africa and other settler societies, as well as other nations emerging from the British empires, have long been deeply intertwined. Saul is a model world historian, so attuned to globalizing discourses on the one hand, and to thickness and complexity of particular societies and places on the other. Substantively and methodologically, Saul has a great deal to teach us. That teaching begins this evening. Not literally, we're teaching hard here. But still, that teaching begins this evening with his talk entitled Frontiers of Scientific Knowledge in South Africa, Global Science and National Horizons. A talk, I haven't read it, but I think marks Saul's transition into writing the history of South Africa in its post-apartheid era. Please join me in welcoming the new Smuts Professor, Saul DeBow.
Thank you so much, Gary. In Long Walk to Freedom, Nelson Mandela recalls how, while at secondary school, he witnessed the Xhosa praise poet, Kruna Mkwai, divide the stars of the galaxy amongst the nations of the world. In the course of an exhilarating performance, Mkwai conceded the Milky Way to rapacious European colonizers and the constellations to various African societies. At a critical moment, the Mbongi dramatically lowered his voice, sank down on his knee, and claimed the gleaming morning star for the House of Xhosa. As starstruck, Mandela experienced uncommon feelings of pride. This episode is recalled by microbiologist Potso Mokele in his introduction to Africa's Giant Eye, which celebrates the success of SALT, the South African Large Telescope, now one of South Africa's proudest scientific achievements. This evening, I shall talk about the importance of deep time in South Africa's self-image as a democratic entrant to the global community of nations. I shall reflect on the ways in which appeals to national pride and patriotism have long been an integral part of South African scientific history. This process can be traced to at least the 18th century, when European curiosity stimulated traveler explorers to visit the southern tip of Africa. In my own work, I've sought to distinguish between different phases of knowledge creation: colonial nationalist, imperial, Afrikaner nationalist, and African nationalist. This lecture draws directly from a book I'm writing on the scientific imagination in South Africa, together with William Beinart, who is here tonight. The section on the 18th and early 19th century was to have been written by Patrick Harries, who introduced me to African history at the University of Cape Town. Patrick died suddenly 2 years ago, and this lecture is dedicated to him. If he was here, he would sit in the front with a great smile on his face, and he would tell me afterwards that it was splendid, but I'd got it all wrong. I also want to acknowledge Magdalene College, which is hosting this occasion. I've been very happy at Magdalene. It's a wonderful college. It's not just beautiful, it's also very humane, and I would pay tribute to our master and to our president for instilling those very particular qualities, which are perhaps unusual in Cambridge. I also want to acknowledge with gratitude and feel honored, say how honored I am to be part of the history faculty, and in particular the World History Group within history. A tremendous group of people to work with. It's fantastic. The students are great. They really are. Cambridge is a good place to be. But nothing makes me happier than to welcome my friends and family, and I'm going to single some of them out just to make sure that I do remember them all. Sina, Talitha, Beth, Jess, Beth, I did mention Beth, Thomas, Anne, Jan, David has come all the way from Massachusetts, and Libby. It's really wonderful to have you here. Some of you are used to in the family WhatsApp group having me profess and doom-laden predictions and links to the Financial Times. Well, you never respond, but I'm afraid you're a captive audience tonight. Wise division of the heavens between whites and blacks evokes a fundamental tension between particularist and universalist visions of South Africa. We see this in Mandela's political formations. He moved from being a race-conscious Africanist to an advocate of multiculturalism, and after his release from prison, a committed and charismatic advocate of non-racism, human rights, and reconciliation. For some of the ANC, the rainbow nation of Mandela and Tutu was too much of a concession to the old order. Thabo Mbeki, Mandela's deputy, was one of these. Seeking to escape Mandela's long shadow, Mbeki expounded his own vision of what he called the African Renaissance. This combined a strongly developmentalist and technocratic approach with an Africanist commitment to the advance of indigenous knowledge. In an iconic speech marking the adoption of the new post-apartheid South African constitution, Mbeki proclaimed himself an African. He affirmed that he owed his being to the Khoi and the San, the blood of the Malay slaves who came from the east, and also to the migrants who left Europe to find a new home on our native land. Being part of all these people, and in the knowledge that none dare contest that assertion, he asserted, "I am an African." The speech was widely interpreted at the time as a profession of racial inclusivity, and to some extent it was. And yet closer inspection of the text reveals nagging doubts. At times, and in fear, he confessed, "I have wondered whether I should concede equal citizenship of our country to the leopard and the lion, the elephant and the springbok, the hyena, the black mamba, and the pestilential mosquito." As president of South Africa, these doubts came to the fore, and Mbeki became reflexively Afrocentric. He became convinced that HIV/AIDS was as much a blight on the dignity of African personhood as a matter of public health. Western pharma companies, he concluded, were willfully exploiting the AIDS crisis in order to sell their drugs and experiment on Africans. Tragically, this drew Mbeki into the camp of AIDS denialism. He rejected a rollout of antiretroviral therapies in favor of indigenous solutions, including a fraudulent drug known as viridine, which had no positive benefits whatsoever other than to enrich its promoters. Hundreds of thousands of lives were unnecessarily sacrificed until the government was forced to change its policies. South Africa now has the largest antiretroviral rollout program in the world. In other respects, the modernizing Mbeki did great service to science. George Ellis, distinguished cosmologist at the University of Cape Town and co-author of a book, Space-Time with Stephen Hawking, prepared an important position paper in 1994 on behalf of the Royal Society of South Africa. The Royal Society was established in the immediate aftermath of the South African Boer War, along with its more demotic partner, the South African Association for the Advancement of Science. Both were key civic institutions in the first new South Africa. Together they sought to detoxify British imperialism by presenting universal science as the cool spirit of reason and reconciliation. Now, as the second, and the miracle of the second new South Africa was being mapped, George Ellis argued that 21st century South Africa should prepare itself to become part of the global community. He thought it unlikely that the country would become a great power during the next century on account of the limited human and natural resources. It would instead have to find an appropriate niche where its resources could be maximized through cooperation. This entailed taking advantage of the country's position on the African continent and in the relatively undeveloped Southern Hemisphere. 2 years later, the government published a white paper preparing for the 21st century. The policy document made the point that science was about more than satisfying utilitarian objectives, declaring that we should not be a second-class nation chained forever to the treadmill of feeding and clothing ourselves. Big science, dare one say, blue skies research, was given a significant boost, especially astronomy, paleontology, and Antarctic research. All 3 southern hemisphere spheres of activity sought to explore frontiers of knowledge within the frame of deep time and space. Astronomy was a particular beneficiary of the post-apartheid order. It has the distinction of being the first scientific discipline to gain institutional backing. This was by virtue of the creation of the Royal Observatory, established in the Cape in 1820 by the British Admiralty. Thomas Leclerc, the most influential of the early world astronomers, arrived at the Cape in 1834. And for more than 35 years, he worked to embed astronomy in Cape scientific and civic life. One of his great projects was the construction of a meridian arc. This was essential to achieving certain practical aims, such as navigation, measurement, and mapping. By the end of the century, in the hands of David Gill, the arc of the meridian became the celestial equivalent of the imperial passage from the Cape to Cairo. There was also a larger scientific problem to be resolved going back to the 1750s, when the French astronomer Abbe Leclerc's measurements suggested that the southern hemisphere was more flattened than the north. This implied counterintuitively that the Earth was shaped a bit like a pear. Over many years of laborious mountain climbing with heavy sensitive equipment, Leclerc established that Leclerc's calculations were indeed soundly based. His minor and forgivable error was not to have taken into account the microgravitational effects of the Cape's mountain masses on its plumb line. It's a long and captivating story involving people like George Everest, which I don't have the time to narrate. Happily, it ends up vindicating Leclerc's technical abilities and Newtonian physics as well. Also in 1834, the renowned British scientist John Herschel arrived at the Cape with his family. Herschel constructed his own private telescope in the garden of his suburban estate. Together with his wife Margaret, the Herschels spent long nights sweeping the skies in order to catalogue the star clusters, nebulae, and double stars of the southern hemisphere. Liberal-minded and independent of means, Herschel became a key figure in the Cape's emerging scientific community. Together, Herschel and Leclerc observed the appearance of Halley's Comet in 1835. The following year, they entertained Charles Darwin when the Beagle docked at Simonstown. Darwin was an enormous admirer of Herschel, and he recorded that the Cape was one of those colonies around the world in which little embryo infants are hatching. This embryo was not merely a facsimile of provincial England. It was already in the process of being coloured by local discoveries and priorities. Herschel was fascinated by the Cape's unique botanical riches, planting his garden with indigenous feignboss bulbs, and drawing pleasing landscapes and mountain views with the aid of a Cameron cedar. He played a leading role in devising a state-funded educational system that was independent of church oversight and geared to the acquisition of secular and scientific knowledge. The Herschels and the Leclercs were critical of British imperial war-making on the Cape frontier. Margaret Herschel identified her husband in a diary as being on the side which humanity and justice dictate, which is guarded by the mournful minority at the Cape. 150 years later, astronomy was again positioning itself as a progressive, enlightened project. After years of political isolation, there was a real prospect of re-entrance into the global community of knowledge. South Africa became the first and the only country in the world to decommission its nuclear arsenal, and soon the swords of big science were being turned into plowshares. Bernie Fanaroff, a Cambridge-trained astronomer who gained an international reputation in the 1970s for his work in the classification of radio galaxies, had given up scientific research to spend the struggle years working for a trade union. In 1994, he joined the government. He was followed a year later by Rob Adam, a physicist who had spent 10 years in prison accounting for ANC activities. Fanaroff and Adam became directors of the hugely ambitious Square Kilometre Array radio telescope project. The SKA promises to be the world's biggest telescope. It comprises a network of thousands of dishes and antennae spread in South Africa and Australia, with its headquarters at Jogging Bank outside Manchester. When completed, it will allow astronomers to catalogue radio sources with unprecedented speed and sensitivity, as well as providing a glimpse into the moment before stars and galaxies form, searching for extraterrestrial cradles of life, and testing Einstein's general theory of relativity. The South African component of the SKA professes a strong developmentalist agenda. Africa, it is hoped, will be integrated into European and global science. A new generation of African scientists and technicians will receive advanced training. The infrastructure of very fast computing and big data will benefit the country. Local communities will be able to take advantage of educational and employment opportunities. Yet, as colleagues in a team like Cheryl Walker and Stellenbosch are showing, the SKA may prove problematic for those living in its environments. The Karoo is not a pristine area of semi-desert. It's been populated from the beginnings of human time, and it has long been a site of contestation over land. Locals seem to be led to believe that by square kilometre array, they meant literally an area of 1 square kilometre. In fact, the 200 dishes involved in the initial phase are spread out over some 30 large farms. The core site, extending over some 130,000 kilometres, threatens to impose heavy restrictions on human activity. Mobile phones and other devices emitting radio waves may interfere with the telescope's operation. A battle of resources based on bandwidth frequency thus pits the needs of global science against the interests of local communities. In Hawaii, First Nation peoples have protested forcefully against the erection of a giant optical telescope on the sacred site of Mauna Kea, in a striking instance of colliding global and indigenous cosmologies. By contrast, in South Africa, local and global tensions currently focus on modernity's distribution of material benefits. The SKA builds on the success of SALT, an 11-metre optical telescope standing proudly on a plateau above the town of Sutherland. At the inauguration of the telescope in 2005, President Thabo Mbeki predicted that this giant iron Karoo will tell us as yet unknown and exciting things about ourselves. The multinational venture would provide all humanity with the largest and most modern single optical infrared telescope in the southern hemisphere, while enabling our country and the continent to remain among the front ranks of those involved in astronomy. And then, in an interesting leap of the imagination, he proceeded between the cosmic potential of SALT and the new visitor center of Marapeng, Setswana, or the place where we once lived. Marapeng sits at the center of a vast paleontological storehouse, west of Johannesburg. For Mbeki, it stood as living proof that our country was the cradle of humanity. For South Africans as human beings, it was appropriate to continue the search for the origins and the infinite beginnings of the universe in the very geographic space that gave birth to Homo sapiens. That's Mbeki. The cradle is a UNESCO World Heritage Site that has been yielding hugely important fossils dating back 3.5 million years. Very recent discoveries, like the 2 million-year-old bipedal hominin Homo naledi, have raised the prospect that the fossilized bones might have been purposely buried in the complex cave systems. On this basis, Lee Berger, the new Indiana Jones of South African paleontology, makes the remarkable claim that Naledi might have been capable of symbolic behavior and complex social organization. Philip Tobias, grand old man of South African paleontology, veteran anti-apartheid intellectual, and towards the end of his life, praise singer of the African Renaissance, was justifiably proud of the World Heritage Site. He personally did a great deal to bring it about. In a keynote address to a conference on the African Rene sites in 2002, he captured the spirit of the moment by claiming that South Africa's hominid Australopithecines were the progenitors of all, the progenitor of all living humans, that Africa gave the world its first culture, and that Southern African hominids were not a Southern African aberration, but a Pan-African revelation. This inspiring message played well in post-apartheid's brief, non-racial global moment. It was not always thus. At the time of the Vietnam War, rival schools of American anthropologists imagined Southern African Bushmen either as natural-born hunters or, alternatively, as exemplars of peaceful, non-hierarchical cooperation. Recall the opening scene of Stanley Kubrick's 2001: Space Odyssey, which portrays one group of warring primates making use of a bone culled from a large animal to defeat a rival troop. The winner, exultant in victory, throws the weaponized bone skywards, wherein it transforms into a spaceship. Kubrick's rendition of Man as Killer Ape came to him from reading the popular sociobiologist Robert Ardrey, author of bestsellers like The Territorial Imperative. Ardrey was in turn deeply influenced by the Witwatersrand University paleontologist Raymond Dart, whose fanciful postulate of Australopithecine osteodendrocratic culture was inescapably linked to predatory violence and bloodlust. This theory has been comprehensively debunked. By contrast, Dart's inspired hunch that Australopithecines represent a crucial missing link in hominid evolution has largely stood the test of time. Raymond Dart announced his discovery of Australopithecus in 1925 in the journal Nature, on the basis of a small, delicate fossil skull which he had just extracted from breccia blasted out of a limestone quarry at Town in the Northern Cape. Dart saw the juvenile Town skull as the missing link between apes and humans, and thus as vindication of Darwin's prediction that Africa could prove to be the cradle of the human race. For many years, Dart was derided for his colonial audacity. Until the 1950s, metropolitan science took the view that modern man was far more likely to have emerged in China or in Europe. One of Dart's strongest critics was Sir Arthur Keith, a president of the Royal Anthropological Institute and a leading eugenist, who was not well disposed to theories emanating from the margins. Keith has strongly implicated the famous Piltdown fossil forgery, which gave rise to the Brexit-friendly view that early man was an Englishman who once roamed the Sussex Downs. Tobias, always a passionate defender of Dart, fingered Keith as a likely Piltdown conspirator, accusing him of pursuing 2 decades of vocal, vigorous, and authoritative rejection of Dart. Dart was a charismatic, consummate performer who was given to speculation and guesswork. He was also a hyperdiffusionist, much influenced by fellow Australian Ralph and Smith. Throughout his working life, Dart attributed Paleolithic cultural advance in southern Africa to direct influences emanating from the Near or Far East. When the Cambridge archaeologist, Gertrude Caton Thompson, presented her findings in support of the indigenous origins of Great Zimbabwe in 1929, a disgusted Dart stormed out of the lecture room. Dart and his mentor, Robert Broom, whose discoveries at Sterkfontein, the cradle of mankind, provided important confirmatory evidence for the importance of Australopithecus, were habitual splitters. Paleontology was for them all about finding original ancestral types and stocks. They were strongly disposed to stress difference over similarity. Freud's narcissism of small differences could be the epitaph of more than one paleontologist of this generation. Paleoanthropology is a discipline where the object of discovery is uniquely identified with the discoverer. Ancestral lines of descent mirror academic links of patrimony and patronage. Tobias never made a major fossil discovery of his own, and instead inherited the town's fossil child together with Dart's chair. Tobias's protection of the legacy of Raymond Dart is partly to be explained in psychological terms, though Dart evidently became a substitute father to him. And yet father and son were very different intellectually. Tobias confidently professed the unity of humankind, whereas Dart was fixated on the origins of human difference. Tobias could never confront this contradiction. Jan Smuts, who was not a father figure to me, was also concerned with such questions. Ejected from my ministerial office in 1924, Smuts spent a productive decade in opposition, developing his views about science and philosophy. In 1925, he served as president of the South African Association for the Advancement of Science. And in his presidential address, he made a remarkable effort to shift scientific emphasis from the European continent, home 19th century science, to the southern hemisphere, and so to demonstrate how this might contribute to the sum total of human knowledge. In order to achieve this hemispheric reorientation, Smuts posited Africa, and in particular the Witwatersrand watershed of South Africa and the Rift Valley to the north, as marking a great scientific divide among the continents. Smuts thought that it was along this east-west axis that scientific prospectors might find the most precious and the richest veins of knowledge. In respect of human paleontology, Smuts was highly receptive to the significance of Australopithecus. He hastened to congratulate Dart on an epoch-making discovery, assuring him that it reflects luster on all South Africa. Without giving unequivocal support to Dart, this was only a matter of 2 or 3 years after his announcement, Smuts cited Darwin in support of the view that Africa might turn out to be the cradle of mankind. Considered together with other recent fossil finds, there was now accumulating evidence that South Africa might, in Smuts's words, become the mecca of human paleontology. Smuts did not infer that common origins meant commonality. On the contrary, Africa might not turn out to be the cradle of mankind as much as one of the cradles, a clear suggestion of his willingness to entertain multilinear theories of human evolutionary divergence. Our Bushmen, he wrote, are nothing but living fossils whose contemporaries disappeared from Europe many thousands of years ago. They were analogous to true living fossils like cycads, botanical survivors from the Jurassic era. One of South Africa's distinct advantages as a field of scientific research, he argued, was that being thousands of years behind the times, evolutionary processes and biological problems could be studied from life. One person who did just that was Lawrence van der Post, Prince Charles's spiritual advisor, who built a career as the global oracle of Bushmanhood. In his 1925 lecture, Smuts accorded great significance to the new but still controversial theory of continental drift, originally espoused by the German meteorologist and polar expert Alfred Wegener in 1912. A decade later, the South African geologist Alex Logie de Toy began to put a new spin on the concept by modifying Wegener's focus on the original supercontinent known as Pangaea. Based on his detailed understanding of rock formation in the Karoo system, de Toy proposed the existence of 2 original supercontinents, Laurasia to the north and Gondwana to the south. He argued that the fracturing of Gondwanaland later gave birth to the modern land masses of Africa, South America, India, and Australia. De Toy lent vital support to the Wegener thesis in a book titled Our Wandering Continents. While endorsing the theory of continental drift, which was only confirmed when plate tectonics were discovered roughly 2 decades later, de Toy's effort to elaborate the architecture of the globe subtly modified Wegener's approach. This reorientation southwards was signaled by a motto inserted in the title page of de Toy's book, Africa Forms the Key. Smuts's reading of de Toy's early work gave Africa a new global centrality, since it could now be viewed as the mother continent from which South America, Australasia, and India had carved off. By placing South Africa at the center of what he called the Great Divide, Smuts was making a case for the country's singularity as well as its universal significance. He did not, however, dwell on the importance of India, from which the term Gondwanaland is derived. As Pratik Chakrabarti, someone in the audience, is showing in an article soon to be published in Past and Present, the name is derived from the ancient Gonds. It was deployed by British colonial ethnographers and scientists who were entranced by the region's volcanic landscape, its fossils, and its tribal inhabitants. In Chakrabarti's view, the idea of Gondwana was used to link the evolution of landscape and the peopling of India in ways that resonated with colonial ethnology, geology, and Christian faith. So too in the case of Smuts. It was Smuts's interest and expertise in botany. He was an acknowledged authority on felt grasses, that disposed him to accept the Wegener de Toy system. He dismissed as a European fallacy the view that the South African plant distribution was the consequence of southern migration of the temperate flora of Europe, drawing instead on Darwin's theory in a letter to Hooker that the development of higher plant forms may have taken place in an ancient isolated continent or large island, perhaps near the South Pole. Smuts suggested that the unique Cape floral kingdom, as well as the country's tropical and subtropical flowering plants, were most likely derived from Gondwanaland. In effect, Smuts was proposing for South Africa what Australian scientists were hypothesizing at much the same time: the existence of great southlands in Permian times linking Australasia to Antarctica. In both cases, this interpretation helped to challenge deep-seated feelings of colonial isolation and inferiority based on southern hemispheric marginality. Botany was also Smuts's way into meteorology and climate, fields that to his regret had so far elicited only mild scientific interest. In 1931, he would explain climate as the single greatest factor responsible for racial divergence. He was also much concerned about climate change in respect of the progressive desiccation of the land, as recently highlighted by the 1923 Drought Investigation Commission in South Africa. The dearth of scientific knowledge about the African climate could be remedied by establishing meteorological observatories in the Antarctic so as to improve long-range weather forecasting. Smuts proposed a joint Australian-South African Antarctic station for the purposes of climatic research. This would have the additional merit of reinforcing Commonwealth solidarity. The title of Smuts's 1925 address, South Africa in Science, was carefully chosen. He was concerned not only to detail the history of science as practiced in South Africa, but more ambitiously to demonstrate the country's significance in, that is to say, for universal science. By invoking deep geological time in respect of botanical and anthropological processes, he was suggesting that the deep past offered modern scientists unique research possibilities, as well as holding the key to stable and permanent future progress. South Africa, in other words, was integral to modern science, just as science was integral to the country's future. In 1929, the British Association returned to South Africa as guests. A high-powered delegation, including 44 fellows of the Royal Society and the atomic physicist Sir Ernest Rutherford, were amongst the 500 visitors. Throughout, conspicuous, almost painful efforts were made by the visitors and their hosts to reinforce the theme of dominion, parity, and national self-respect. Jan Hofmeyr, Smuts's political deputy and a noted liberal-minded intellectual in his own right, was president of the South African Scientific Association in 1929. He was greatly concerned to highlight the advances that had been made since the last visit of the British Association in 1905, when he said science remained dependent on overseas expatriates and so could be termed exotic. Science was now much more mature and institutionally rooted. Hofmeyr referred to this generational change as the South Africanization of science. He hastened to add that there was nothing narrow about scientific South Africanism. Indeed, to be so would be false to the spirit of science. For Hofmeyr, as for Smuts, science was a means to articulate an outward-looking form of patriotism, an ethnically inclusive South Africanism. Their emphasis on the country's scientific potential might even be seen as a conscious effort in what we might now call, intellectual decolonialization. The title of Hofmeyr's speech, Africa and Science, nodded to Smuts, but it was much more expansive. Hofmeyr proceeded to articulate an ambitious program for science that amounted to a new form of sub-imperialism. Having South Africanized science, the next objective was, in Hofmeyr's words, to Africanize it. He duly presented South Africa to his British hosts as the southern gateway by which science itself could be made effectively to permeate Africa. In particular, he highlighted the potential of medicine, economics, anthropology, paleontology, and linguistics. These disciplines offered the richest opportunities to those who would investigate racial problems in the true spirit of science, and in discovering solutions, the clash of color might be averted. Africa could thus be seen as a great laboratory wherein scientists might test diverse social and political theories as to the relations between white and colored races, all in quotes. It was as a laboratory for race that South Africa marketed itself globally, not least in fields like educational sociology. One of the most enthusiastic responses came from the Carnegie Corporation of New York, which under the energetic leadership of Frederick Kepler led to a major investigation of the problem of white poverty in South Africa. The 5-volume report, completed in 1932, remains a landmark of South African social science. It was also important for thinking around the problem of race in the American South and served as a progenitor of Gunnar Merkel's American dilemma. What we see here is evidence of a new relationship being formed between the southern periphery of Africa and the rising international metropole of New York. For Smuts, international statesmanship, institution building, and scientific advance were powerfully conjoined. He gave philosophical expression to this view in a treatise entitled Holism and Evolution, published in 1926, which ruminated on the organic and evolutionary links between the smallest elements of matter and the largest problems of the universe. These ideas formed the basis of his presidential address to the centenary meeting of the British Association in London in 1931, where he recruited quantum theory and relativity to advance his idea that the nature of living things is determined not by the nature of their parts, but by the nature of their organization. The philosophical and scientific rigor of holism has been much debated. At the 1929 scientific meeting of the British and South African Associations, Lancelot Hogben, then professor of zoology at the University of Cape Town and soon to become a leading figure in left-wing anti-eugenist thinking worldwide, delivered a withering materialist or mechanist analysis which said that Smuts's metaphysics was absolute rubbish. J.S. Haldane, an advocate of biological holism or organicism, was more sympathetic to Smuts at the Cape Town Symposium in 1929 and then again in his Gifford lectures. When I first encountered this debate, I cheered with Hogben and overlooked his grandstanding. What I missed, unlike Peter, is that Smuts's holism, whatever its merits as philosophy, did a great deal to influence the development of international ecological thought and New Age philosophy too. In political terms, holism revealed how the nationality of a small independent country like South Africa might find more capacious expression in the larger identity of the Commonwealth. In respect of domestic white politics, the metaphor amounted to a belief in the need to transcend white ethnic differences and to strive for an inclusive nationalism that laid more emphasis on place than on race. In other words, on patriotism rather than nativist nationalism. The political slogan of South Africanism, which defines Smuts's vision, stands in direct contrast to that of his long-term political rival J.B.M. Hertzog, who campaigned in favor of South Africa first. Where did we hear that last? An influential Stellenbosch University theoretical physicist, A.C. Silier, who had studied in Germany under Heisenberg, was quick to see the danger. In his view, Smutsian holism implied subsuming South Africa within the British Empire. Both these slogans gave house room in the polis to whites alone. This was a time when the racial question was code for conflict between English and Afrikaans speakers. It was seen as largely distinct from the color question. Hertzog framed his 1929 general election campaign around the Black Peril. Smuts was a more high-minded kind of segregationist. In 1929, he delivered the Rhodes Lectures at Oxford. There, he proposed segregation as a compromise between the concept of permanent racial inferiority, the view of slavery, and the principle of equality and fraternity, which he identified as arising out of the French Revolution. Nothing could be worse, said Smuts, than designing a policy that would de-Africanize the African and turn him either into a beast of the field or into a pseudo-European. In place of biological determinism, Smuts drew heavily on theories of cultural relativism, drawn from British social anthropology, as well as the practice of indirect rule in colonial Africa. I developed this line of thinking in my first book 30 years ago. What I missed there was that Smuts was drawing not only from social anthropology, but also from physical anthropology, paleoanthropology, and conceptions of deep geological time, all nicely wrapped up in layers of Christian metaphysics, vestiges of vitalism, elements of evolutionism, and an early reading of Einsteinian relativity in space-time. In the Second World War, Smuts narrowly succeeded in bringing South Africa into the war on the side of the Allies. As in the Great War, he became a key member of the Imperial War Cabinet. He was an intimate of Churchill's to the extent that Churchill's secretary, John Colville, proposed a plan which seems to have gained some traction in the British royal family, that Smuts should become British Prime Minister in the event of Churchill drowning in his bath. Back home, Smuts gave shelter to the Greek royal family. Crown Princess Frederica, to whom he came rather too close, spent time with him in his official Cape Town residence and on his farm Doornkloof. This rambling house on the veld, with its outstanding library holding unique collections in subjects like botany, law, and British idealist philosophy, was a place of pilgrimage for Smuts's admirers. British High Commissioner David Ormsby Gore was one of the enchanted visitors. Later, as ambassador to Washington, he became intimate house guest of the Kennedys. Smuts also sheltered the French prehistorian and renowned world expert on rock art, Henri Breuil, having spirited him out of Lisbon to spend the war years working on the country's new archaeological survey. In December 1942, just months after the decisive Battle of El Alamein in North Africa, in which South African troops played a major role in defeating Rommel, Smuts invited Breuil to Doornkloof. There they discussed the antiquity of humankind. Smuts took the side of those like his son, who considered that the origins of humankind in Africa dated back to the Pliocene. Breuil was not convinced, but there was evidently concordance between Smuts and the Abbe in their spiritual understanding of mankind's place in the cosmos. Both were committed to a view of evolutionism that was consistent with Christian theology. The mystical communion and networks of patronage that drew the French prehistorian together with the South African politician was amply reflected in the foreword that Smuts wrote to Breuil's book, Beyond the Bounds of History, 1949. For me at least, wrote Smuts, there is a very heartening message in prehistory. On that larger, truer time scale, we see a deeper meaning of our story than that which history conveys to us. On the time scale of history, which covers only a few thousand years, we do not see much essential progress. Institutions change, forms of human life and existence change, but man himself remains much the same. To see the true picture, we have to take a large time scale. We have to call in the witness of prehistory, and then the answer is no longer in doubt. The progress, physically, mentally, and socially, is almost beyond belief. Smuts and Breuil shared a paternalist view that the Bushmen of South Africa evinced qualities of the human spirit which enlarged understandings of humanity. But neither credited Bushmen as being fully human in the modern sense. Breuil went to great efforts, for example, to show that the astonishing central frieze in cave paintings found in Namibia, the so-called White Lady of the Bruntberg, depicted a beautiful girl from the court of Knossos in Crete. The great European prehistorian and Jesuit priest had evidently failed to notice that she was neither white nor female. He had somehow overlooked her penis. Smuts steered clear of eugenics and spent an entire political career avoiding stirring up racial passions. Confrontations with Gandhi over Asian immigration and rights, and occasional inadvertent insults being notable exceptions to this rule. Nevertheless, Smuts was a profound intellectual racialist, to revive an older sociological term. Always a paternalist, he believed in the existence of essential cultural and spiritual differences, and he could not countenance the democracy of equal citizenship other than in some very distant future. In 1948, Smuts lost the apartheid election and was once more in political opposition. One consolation was that he had just been made Chancellor of Cambridge. This was recognition of Smuts's role in 2 world wars. Just as importantly, it was a self-congratulatory pat on the back by a British establishment, spellbound by the romantic story of a Boer guerrilla fighter in the South African War, turned imperial statesman and international peacemaker. In his address, the Vice-Chancellor spoke about how defeat could be more ennobling than victory. He called Smuts a philosopher king who was about to become the dikaios, the just man made prefect. 1949 was also the first year of the apartheid government. Many feared that the new government would retreat into isolation and that the Boer brand of neo-Calvinism professed by its leaders would narrow intellectual horizons. Basil Schonland, the scientific protege of Smuts, who trained at the Cavendish Laboratory and then went on to serve as the wartime scientific advisor to General Montgomery, gave up his leadership of the South Africa's Council for Scientific and Industrial Research, which he founded, and moved to England, where he became the Director of Atomic Energy Research at Harvard. In spite of constant jibes, the new nationalist government were not flat earthers, and there were many areas of science and technology which prospered during the apartheid years. The government continued to build what Bill Freund has recently called the Smutsian developmental state, albeit guided by very different priorities. Government commitment to self-sufficiency led to the creation of a strategic petrochemical industry based on the German Fischer-Tropsch chemical process. The apartheid government worked effectively to maintain international links in fields like conservation, agriculture, and geophysics. Political isolation may even have conferred some advantages. South Africa conducted the world's first heart transplant in 1967. Christian Barnard, who led the program, was unencumbered by the sorts of ethical considerations that had held back the Americans, allowing him to perform the operation before Norman Shumway at Stanford. Most conspicuously, nuclear science took advantage of the country's plentiful supplies of uranium and fear of communism. Primed by techno-nationalist pride, this led to the country producing a not-so-secret nuclear bomb by the early 1980s. Astronomy was also a beneficiary. As late as the 1960s, the country's 2 leading observatories were British-run and controlled. European and American universities operated their own telescopes around Johannesburg and Bloemfontein. Radio astronomy at Hartbeespoort was restricted to tracking NASA space missions and French satellites, and so fell under the shadow of the growing security apparatus. By the early 1960s, the British were considering winding down their operations and moving their telescopes to Australia. There were scientific successes, such as the Radcliffe Observatory's discovery announced in 1952 that the universe was double the size of current estimates. This resolved a puzzle whereby the Earth seemed to be older than the universe itself, and it reminds me of the Cale's great work exactly 200 years before. But the broader picture suggests that for much of the 20th century, astronomy in South Africa was largely the question of hosting viewing platforms for the benefit of overseas universities who required pollution-free portals into southern skies. Anti-apartheid sentiment prompted the Swedes to abandon their involvement in the Boyden telescope in 1966, and the Americans to terminate their deep space tracking commitments in 1974. The Council for Scientific and Industrial Research was discomfited by the lack of national control over its own telescopes. It was at this nadir in South African astronomy that the South African government intervened and proposed consolidating the Cape Town, Pretoria, and Johannesburg observatories on a site just outside of Sutherland. The Sutherland region has long been associated with mammal-like reptiles called thorapsids, first discovered and identified in the mid-19th century by the multi-talented, self-taught Scottish geologist and roadmaker Alexander Bain. His discovery of Dicynodon in 1844 aroused the interest of T.H. Huxley and Richard Owen. These 250-year-old, million-year-old fossils are now seen as evidence of global formal and floral interchange, and therefore as further evidence of the workings of continental drift. In announcing Sutherland as the site for the new consolidated observatory, the CSIR referred to the remote village of Dork as a new name in the world of astronomy, where the science of the stars will meet the science of the earth. On the occasion of the opening of the observatory in 1973, the smiling Margaret Thatcher, British Secretary of State for Science and Technology, sat alongside a gruff South African Prime Minister John Vorster, who was presiding over a ceremony attended by 400 scientific and diplomatic dignitaries. 30 years after his release from internment by Smuts as a Nazi sympathizer, Vorster stressed the necessity for international and bilateral cooperation in efforts to further knowledge of the southern skies. He was at the time keen to break South Africa's isolation, and he wanted to establish a diplomatic presence in Africa. Thatcher was praised for lending elegance and distinction to the occasion. She declined to be drawn into discussion about the precise nature of the bilateral agreement, which preserved a third of the observing time in Sutherland to be made available to British universities. The rumour doing the rounds at the time was that she was also trying to sell South Africa a Concorde or two. The story of South Africa's engagement in the Antarctic also sheds interesting light on the geopolitics of apartheid science. It begins in the 1920s when a number of Australian and British experts suggested that South Africa might extend its sovereign rights in the Antarctic so as to participate in establishing weather stations. Smuts was an early adopter, as I pointed out. It fitted in well with his view of Gondwanaland science and also with his desire to cement Commonwealth cooperation. The arrival in 1937 of a new physics professor at the University of Cape Town, Reginald James, helped to fire up public interest. James had been a member of Shackleton's Endurance expedition, and he gave riveting lectures in Cape Town about the harrowing fight to survive on ice floes. Incidentally, James also bears the distinction of helping to train two South African Nobel Prize winners, Alan McCormick and Cambridge biophysicist Aaron Klug, who died a week ago at age 92. Despite Smuts' enthusiasm for Antarctic expansionism, the plan failed to gain traction in the troubled interwar period. But right at the end of Smuts' tenure as Prime Minister, things began to change. A South African naval detachment took occupation of Prince Edward and Marion Islands, and a meteorological station was established at what they called Transvaal Cove. Fears of encirclement by the Soviets, who were renewing their Antarctic ambitions, was one stated motivation. This was the Cold War at its most freezing extreme. A strapping young Afrikaner, Hannes Lagrange, served as meteorologist in the Vivian Fuchs-led Commonwealth Transantarctic expedition of 1956 to 1958. In 1960, Lagrange led his own Antarctic expedition, spurred by Prime Minister Verwoerd, who telephoned him to say, South Africa needs you. The process of laying scientific and strategic claim to the Antarctic was presented as a South African and more particularly an Afrikaner triumph. Lagrange and his team were honoured with newly minted Antarctica medals on their return home to Cape Town in 1962. English-speaking South African newspapers featured jokey cartoons with black and white penguins on an otherwise pristine white landscape. This was 2 years after Sharpeville, and in the midst of apartheid's most hubristic phase of American engineering. Lagrange's exploits illustrated well Klaus Dodds' point that the Antarctic serves as a kind of fantasy space for white European men to perform firsts and record their achievements in the name of national and individual power. The history of state involvement in the Antarctic was given a fresh lease of life in the post-1994 era, with the commissioning of a new purpose-built polar research and supply vessel, Dallas 2, in 2012. Whereas strategic considerations had sustained South Africa's polar interests in the apartheid years, now biodiversity and climate change research with a new priority. Antarctic research, together with astronomy and paleontology, together constitute a big science triptych in contemporary South Africa, all committed in different ways to the study of science in space and time. In this lecture, I've argued that South Africa's key contributions to global science have taken advantage of the country's geographic position in the Southern Hemisphere. They were all products of the optimistic moment of the country's miracle of transition in the 1990s and its re-entry into the global community. I've suggested that all three areas of comparative advantage were also identified in the interwar era by Jan Smuts. Like Mandela, Smuts had broad international ambitions based on peaceful coexistence. He was responsible for inserting the phrase human rights into the preamble of the United Nations Charter. But Smuts's version of human rights did not include the majority of South Africans. Smuts was an articulate and determined opponent of imperialism who went on to become a key advocate of the idea of Commonwealth. He sought to challenge Eurocentric science in the literal sense by showing that Africa was of global significance. Smuts promoted South Africa as a laboratory for the study of the world problem of race. He sought to decolonize science by South Africanizing it. And in doing so, he also mapped out a sub-imperial role for science as the vector for expansion and influence within Africa. This raises a number of conceptual issues which I want to raise by way of conclusion. First, the question of the relationship between colonial and indigenous knowledge. In the 1990s, the moment in which global world history came to maturity, there was considerable interest in the hows and means of knowledge diffusion. The early optimistic years of the internet, which happened to coincide with the vogue for academic post-colonialism, offered a wholly new, free-flowing metaphorical repertoire. Webs, nodes, interchange, co-production, hybridity, and so on. The new South Africa was born into this expansive and inclusive moment. Today, global intellectual historians, my colleague Shruti Kapila, for instance, are far more aware of blockages, impediments, and misalignments affecting the exchange and distribution of ideas. Ambitious claims for astronomy in South Africa today make lavish promises about its developmental benefits. Exhibitions like Shared Skies juxtapose Aboriginal, Australian, and Khoisan cosmologies in order to show how a shared project of South-South cooperation was foreshadowed by a common human imagination located in deep time. There have been fascinating studies of Bushman and San cosmological conceptions of the universe, but we surely ought to be skeptical of the attempts to use these as background mood music in books and media geared to the promotion of big science astronomy. It should not be assumed that indigenous and global science coexist and interact harmoniously. Perhaps this is what Mandela was getting at when he evoked Mkhi's division of the southern stars between Europeans and Africans. Flowing directly from this, my second point is that relations of power ought to be inserted back into global intellectual history, whether in conceptions of multiple cosmopolitanisms or in ideas about the co-production of knowledge. In the long history of South Africa, the era of the European Enlightenment was relatively open and undecided about race. European scientific travelers and explorers sometimes expressed high regard and genuine curiosity towards the indigenous peoples they encountered. Through the 19th century, ideas about race hardened significantly. Settlers used their growing knowledge about South Africa and its peoples to define hierarchies and mark differences. More subtly, they began to present themselves as the true colonial custodians of the landscape and its peoples, in a process that I like to think of as acquired indigeneity. This process was profoundly exclusionary, all the more so for being a matter of cognition as much as appropriation or occupation. My third and final point suggests that we require a more sophisticated understanding of how mid-level states fit into the overall architecture of global power. Part of the fascination of South Africa for the outside world is that it was a sub-regional power that was too big to ignore, but not large enough to pose a threat to anyone other than in its regional neighborhood. The complexity of the country's peopling, its multi-layered experience of European colonization, as well as the system of segregation and apartheid that made it an international pariah for the last half of the 20th century, makes it eminently suitable as a site for localized global history. Historians of extra-European science have long experimented with models of knowledge diffusion. There's no time to rehearse these now. but I would declare my sympathy for approaches that show how the so-called periphery can act disproportionately on metropolitan cores, and in surprising ways. Roy McLeod's conception of the moving metropolis still has value, more especially when one recognizes that this phrase was borrowed unacknowledged from the great Australian and, one might add, greater British historian Keith Hancock. Hancock had in mind the relationship between Britain and the old white dominions. Sujit Sivasundaram's conception of islanding and partitioning in his study at Sri Lanka seems to me a very suggestive reformulation, not least because it shifts the center of gravity away from the British Empire to the Indian and Pacific Oceans. Australians, including Alison Bashford and Warwick Anderson, are exploring southern hemispheric connections that go beyond dominion relations. Daniela Blechmar's study of botany and visual cultures in the Spanish Empire is suggestive of how knowledge generated in Latin America worked not only to the benefit of Madrid, but also positioned the New World to generate scientific self-knowledge and Creole patriotism. All this suggests a need to pay greater attention to the position of middle-ranking regional powers, about which there is surprisingly little of a theoretical nature in politics or in international relations, as well as in science. I refer here to countries that exhibit ties to historic colonial dependence, but which also manifest aspects of genuine independence and sometimes defiant self-assertion, and in ways that complicate the binary division between colonial and indigenous. Such societies have been able to create viable, self-sustaining infrastructures and the means to become semi-autonomous centers of calculation, without necessarily gaining the questionable status of rising powers. Some of these middle powers are treated as threats or pariahs. South Africa is the notable 20th century example. Iran springs to mind today. Franco's Spain figures too. Insufficiently understood is the ways in which such centers fit within national as well as global priorities, and how the production of scientific knowledge adopts and adapts institutionally, culturally, and politically. It's my contention that science, perhaps more than any other field of activity, has been the key to South Africa's international purchase and presence. There's a great deal more to do here. I've long had in mind the study of how the British Department of Scientific and Industrial Research constituted the start of the First World War, seeded similar organizations during the Second War in India, South Africa, and Australia. All have their own flourishing research laboratories, whereas the British progenitor, followed by New Zealand, became defunct. Why? Perhaps someone in the audience interested, as I am, in the interplay between intellectual and institutional histories will be minded to find out and tell us why.
Thank you, Saul, for that brilliantly stimulating talk, which we'll be thinking about for a long time. As the convener of this gathering, I have the authority to decree that there will be questions or there won't. I hereby decree that there won't. There'll be plenty of time to discuss in detail many of the issues raised in this lecture, but now I think we go on and privately and collectively can continue to honor Saul Dubow, the new Smuts Professor of Common History. Please join me again in giving him a great round of applause. And most importantly, there are drinks outside. Downstairs or upstairs, so please come.
So my question is,